Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 24th of January, and you are watching episode 119 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight in the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode is my guest, Will Shackel, founder of Nuclear for Australia. Will was a 16-year-old Year 11 student at the time he founded Nuclear for Australia in December 2022. His initiative captured the attention of some of the mainstream media, and it wasn't long before he was given space in newsprint and airtime on both radio and television. National media attention resulted with interviews on Sunrise, Ben Fordham Live, 3AW Mornings with Neil Mitchell, ABC Drive with Steve Austin, Chris Kenny on Sky News, A Current Affair, and the infamous Q&A episode with Chris Bowen. Will also appeared before the Senate inquiry on removing the nuclear energy prohibitions in May 2023. As predicted, there was no surprise to the Senate committee's decision rejecting the lifting of the legislative prohibitions on nuclear energy for civilian use. Despite this setback, Nuclear for Australia's petition in support of lifting the ban continues to gather signatures, reaching more than 5,000 of its 20,000 target. Will also attended Climate Alarmist Fest, Conference of Parties, COP28, held in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates from November 30th to the 12th of December 2023. A surprising outcome to the conference was the recognition of the critical role of nuclear energy in reducing carbon emission and to meet net zero 2050 targets. Welcome, Will.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay, Will, thanks for appearing tonight. Really appreciate it. Maybe we can start off with a bit of your background, where you are up to your schooling, because you're in Year 11 and 22 when you founded Nuclear for Australia. So another year's prep passed, so you've done Year 12. So where are you up to now?
Well, yeah, I'm currently in the first years of grade 12, which is a very interesting experience. And obviously last year in grade 11, I founded Nuclear for Australia. So that was a very interesting experience, launching Nuclear for Australia, which would quickly become the largest campaign for nuclear energy in Australia's history, all in the space of year 11. So juggling my academics and this campaigning and advocacy on the side has been a very interesting process. But in terms of where we're at now, we're making fantastic progress. We've got over 15,000 signatures on our petition to lift the bans on nuclear energy. Like I said, we've become the largest campaign for nuclear energy in Australia's history, a grassroots movement of Australians across the country who are calling for the government to consider the role of nuclear energy. And when I look to the year ahead in 2024, despite the exams and the pressure that will ultimately have on me, I think there's also going to be a lot of pressure that we can ultimately have in the debate on nuclear energy in this country. And I really hope that we do make some significant progress this year. And through my campaign, Nuclear for Australia, we are really looking forward to what we're going to be able to do and achieve in 2024.
I think it would have been disappointing that the Senate inquiry came back with a negative result, but that wasn't to be unexpected, really. Like I said, as the title of this show, is Australia immature in regards to nuclear energy? And I believe we've been, quite remiss in regards to going forward, because if you go back to our history, we were the centre of British nuclear testing in the 50s. We had one of the first operational low energy reactors built in Lucas Heights in 58. We've certainly got a crop of great nuclear scientists. I mean, I've had on both Mark Ho and
Yes.
John Harries, who have both been presidents of the Australian Nuclear Association, and obviously you would have met at least one of those in the time. I think John Harries was before the Senate committee as well. So it's not as though we haven't got the expertise and we haven't got people in the industry pushing for it. It's just that we've got no political will, and if anything, we've got a lot more opposition politically than support.
No, I definitely agree. I think you made a lot of excellent points in regards to the fact that Australia is already a nuclear nation, just except for the nuclear power bit, which is probably one of the easiest parts of the nuclear science equation. I think even it's important to consider that Australia in a few decades' time will have floating small reactors floating around our major cities, the AUKUS submarines, and we're going to require a significant nuclear science and technology capability in order to facilitate those submarines. And I think it's important also to realise that if Australia wasn't already uniquely positioned as a nuclear nation, we wouldn't have been able to receive those nuclear submarines. So I think there's already a lot of great things happening in Australia in terms of the nuclear sciences space, whether it's at Lucas Heights, where I think they've got something like 400 PhDs there. It's just simply incredible what they're able to do. They've got the Australia's only nuclear reactor there, which is dedicated to medical research and industrial, all these other industrial outputs and things like that. And Australia is actually renowned around the world for our nuclear capacity, whether it be through that research reactor at Lucas Heights, 30 kilometres from the Sydney CBD, or our other nuclear medicine or other nuclear capabilities. I think the only last thing I'd say in regards to Australia being uniquely positioned as a nuclear nation is probably to say that, you know, we've got the largest uranium reserves in the world, and we're not currently taking advantage of it. So I think, yeah, when you consider all of those different points, Australia has all the prerequisites in place to be a world leader when it comes to nuclear energy. It's just a shame that the bans on nuclear energy are in place to restrict that.
Well, I'll just show a screen here and have a look at two pieces of legislation that are actually blocking our pathway.
I think it's also just important to add that it's in addition to these two, there's also state and territory bans on nuclear energy as well, including my state of Queensland.
Not only that, we've got councils who have got that have got no authority whatsoever, but they're a nuclear-free zone. They're like, you know, these people are just interfering in things that they've got no control over and no authority. But the Australian Radiation and Nuclear Safety Act 1998, that's been there for some time, and prohibition on certain nuclear installations. Nothing in this act is to be taken to authorise the construction or operation of any of the following nuclear installations. A nuclear fuel fabrication plant, that means enriching, I presume. No nuclear power plants, no enrichment plant, and no reprocessing facility. We'd also need things like disposal and that as well, and that's been a bit of a bone of contention for the last few years. And then the overriding real big problem act that we've got is the Environment Protection and Diversity Conservation Act of 1999. Now, that's got a whole suite of sections and that. Now the issue with that is that act was signed up to by the Howard government when we were trying to get a replacement for the Lucas Heights original reactor, HIFAN, and replace it with the Opal. Now, dealing with the Greens, basically Howard was sort of backed in a position where he had to basically sign this act to sort of get them over the line to agree to getting a new reactor, because the other one was, you know, getting past its life. But that act isn't just an overarching legislation that kills basically nuclear energy and development. It also is an act that basically holds up all progress on any development, whether it's a mine, a new industry or whatever, because we have to satisfy so many conditions of that act. And that act was foisted on us by the United Nations. Do you, with COP and that, do you get the view that we're a little bit too over-regulated by outside bodies like the UN?
I think it's a very interesting situation. And obviously, I was at the COP climate change conference organised by the United Nations in December, and I got to see how those sort of events worked. And let me just tell you, I don't actually think much progress was made there for all of the fanfare associated with that event. In terms of the United Nations position, I think it's important to make clear that as part of the United Nations, of course, there's the International Atomic Energy Agency, and they're fantastic advocates for the role of civil nuclear power around the world. Indeed, the Director General, Rafael Grossi, came to Australia a few years ago. They were instrumental in organising the pledge to triple global nuclear energy capacity at COP28, which was signed by 25 nations. They're holding their first World Nuclear Summit in Belgium in March of this year. So in terms of that organisation within the United Nations, I think that they're doing a really good job. In terms of the focus of your question on is Australia being too regulated, I'm not particularly sure in terms of the global influence, in terms of those regulations, if that was true, that other nations and other international bodies were controlling what we were doing in and restricting our access to energy options, then of course that's incredibly regrettable. But I think it's also, I would say, largely self-imposed. Like you said, the bans on nuclear energy were introduced actually under the Howard government in the late 1990s. There was very little debate associated with them. For one, like you said, it was as a result of a negotiation to secure funding for Lucas Heights reactor. For the other, it was a negotiation to secure the GST. So both of these policies were basically just a political trade-off. And when you view it like that, as a political trade-off, and for me as a young person, seeing the consequence that policy has had, I think it's incredible that we would simply just pass nuclear off with so little effort like that, when you consider the consequences that has ultimately had, I think, on the power prices people are now experiencing in Australia, the environmental issues we're experiencing in Australia, and also the future energy security issues we might experience. I think back to the bans, and in terms of the overregulation, I can never stress more that Australia is the only member of the G20 which actually has bans on nuclear energy. So we're in an incredibly unique position in a very bad way with the bans on nuclear energy. I think the point should be that we should be able to consider any technology source. All technology sources must be on the table if the government is serious about acting on the energy and climate crisis. And it really, to be very frank with you, if the government is serious about their arguments against nuclear energy, that nuclear reactors take too long to build or are too expensive, then why can't they just lift the bans on nuclear energy and let the market decide? Because no one would be silly enough to build a nuclear reactor if it indeed took too long or was too costly to build and didn't have a good return on investment. So I think the current policy situation in Australia is a crazy one. We're certainly out of step with the rest of the world. And to your point of the extent of international involvement, I think there's some great work being done by international organisations, but I certainly hope that they're not influencing the current policy in Australia, because they've certainly not left us in a good situation.
I think the other situation, we also are a landmass that has very, very stable geology. So we don't have a lot of problems that other countries face, like across the Pacific Rim and that, with their earthquake situation, volcanoes and other general problems. We also have a very stable political system. We're probably one of the most stable countries in the world for far as geopolitical thing, and they're extremely important. But as you said, it's really what we want to do is just lift the bans and just let the market decide. Now, as for people who are idiots and pump money into nuclear facilities, we do have them. If you look at the cost overruns, when governments get involved in providing the monies for it, we don't seem to be very rational. Now, there's two major projects going on in the Western world at the moment. One is in the United States in Georgia, the vocal additional 2 reactors. Now, they were first muted back in the 2005, approved in 2009, and supposed to be online by 2017 at a cost of $13 billion. We're now up to a situation, and I'll just chuck up a screen.
Yep. No, the Western world hasn't been doing a great job on nuclear.
So we've got the Georgia plant. Now, it wasn't a greenfield site. That's the interesting part. It already has 2 nuclear reactors, and they were just adding reactors 3 and 4. And it should have been a fairly simple operation in regards to, you've got the site, you've got all your approvals, you got the design, although it is a slightly newer design than the ones before, the Westinghouse AP1000s, but this is 2022 figures. Went to $30 million US from about 14, and it's now up to about 34. Reactor 3's now online, and 4 still coming on. So, and the cost overrun is, of course, huge, and someone's got to pick up that bill. And the agreement that's just been passed is that at least $7.5 billion is to be passed on directly to the consumers to be recouped. So that's a bit of a shock for consumers who thought they might be getting reliable, cheap power. The other one that's on the moment is Hinkley Point, Reactor C. Same situation over there. We're now looking at something that was going to be around about the £22 billion. It's now looking like it could be delayed several years and looking at £46 billion. Now, I don't know if you're sort of across the industrial relations field in Australia, but we are not very good at getting projects built on time and on budget. So one of my fears is, if the government's involved and it's handing out the money, it's just going to be a disaster. So hopefully we will have a situation where it is completely up to the market, and the investors pick up the tab, not the public.
I think, yeah, there's a few points to make there. And I would say, when I said the Western world isn't doing a great job at the moment on nuclear, I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that nuclear energy is contributing a lot of power to those nations, whether it's the US, where it's the largest source of clean energy, above, solar and wind. So there's already a large nuclear fleet in those countries, but what we're seeing in terms of recent investment, there have been huge cost overruns and huge time overruns, and a lot of that can be attributed to what I would describe as an overly, I guess, oppressive regulatory system, whether it's in the US with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or in the UK with how they do things. And I think that we should definitely learn from the mistakes that both of those countries have made in terms of their nuclear projects and the cost overruns they're having. And there's even, I think I've heard, even people might have heard of the NuScale reactor project, which was a small modular reactor. And unfortunately, they went bankrupt on that project. Apparently, that was a first of a kind reactor. They had to spend over $500 million US dollars on research and doing the relevant work for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US to get their approval. So when you're spending that kind of money, that because of all of the time, all of the documents that you have to provide to those regulatory bodies, because of just how strict regulation is in the nuclear industry, then ultimately that is going to push up the cost of those reactors. I think In terms of the situation in Australia and what I think would be best, I think it's really important that we look not to the examples around the world where nuclear is, clearly too expensive and taking too long to build, but the countries which are able to do it successfully. One example of that was when I was in the UAE, in Dubai for the COP28 climate conference. I got the opportunity to drive out west to see the Baraka nuclear power plant, which is the first nuclear power plant in the Middle East. It is the largest source of clean energy in the Middle East, and it will provide power for about a quarter of the UAE. It's simply an incredible project. It's 4 reactors which are collectively able to provide a quarter of that country's power. And they were able to do that project on time and on budget for a reasonable cost. And what they did is they purchased off-the-shelf reactors from South Korea in order to do that. So for a country like the UAE, which everyone could imagine has abundant access to fossil fuels, and also obviously being positioned near the equator, could definitely take advantage of solar, they still identified the need for nuclear energy back then in 2009. They're still actually considering building a further 2 reactors. And I think that shows that nuclear as a technology can be inherently economically competitive if being constructed and being operated under the right conditions. And I think Australia should be looking to countries like the UAE, even China, which is got building the most nuclear reactors in the world. I think I've heard that they've got a plan to build 8 nuclear reactors per year. So if you look to those countries, whilst obviously they don't have the same conditions as Australia in terms of employment or whatever, but those countries know how to spend their money, and they know what's going to pay off. And when they compare all of the different energy sources they have available to them, they still see the need for nuclear, and they are still investing in it, which shows that it's economically viable. So I've no doubt that if we were able to do it correctly, and I'd emphasize correctly, that Australia would get a really good return on investment if going nuclear.
I think one of the problems with the Georgia plant was the fact it was the first new reactors built for about 30 years. And a lot of the expertise that the US had, pushing out nuclear power stations in the 60s and 70s, has long gone. And they were struggling with engineers, workers, and all that. Hinkley Point is relying on the French in the main part, and also I think Chinese are in on it as well. So there's reasonable expertise still in France. But like you said, Korea is probably the country that's built the most recent and has had a continuous production line of reactors. So it has its current workforce, which is fairly important. Now, if you look at the Saudi Arabians in regards to what they said at COP, they're looking at building reactors as well.
Yep.
I noticed that Japan isn't even in the race. Japan has sort of given up the ghost again with nuclear power, and there's been some time since it's built a station. But the players again in offering technology to Saudi Arabia will be China, Russia, France, and South Korea. So they haven't issued the licenses yet, so they've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I think the situation in Saudi Arabia is a very interesting one, and it shares a parallels with lots of other countries. Apparently, there's something like 50 countries around the world which are considering using nuclear energy for the first time. I think it's even interesting, the countries which actually signed that pledge at COP28 included countries like Jamaica, which you wouldn't assume is a country in a position to embrace nuclear energy, but they're seeing the need for it. There are so many different countries around the world which are interested in nuclear energy, and I think that Australia is in a very unique position to be one of those countries and be able to access technology from around the world because what we're currently seeing around the world, I think, undoubtedly is a nuclear renaissance occurring. There's a huge wave of nuclear investment, whether it's in research and development of small modular reactors or micro reactors. Obviously, there have been pledges, whether that's the pledge at COP to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050, or even the UK recently made a pledge under Rishi Sunak to quadruple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. France is looking at building something like 16 further nuclear reactors. So there is huge energy in this space, mind the pun, at the moment. And I think the advantage for Australia is, whilst all of this is happening, we are in a perfect position, especially when we're going to have to be doing a lot of work to get ready for the AUKUS submarines, to also put our hands up for nuclear power. We've got the uranium. All we really need to do is reach out to those companies who are currently ramping up their investment in their production of nuclear reactors and take advantage of them initially.
Yeah. The other thing is too, we've also got to come to grips with nuclear waste, and and this is just a basic thing. I mean, we already have nuclear waste products in Australia, especially from the medical field, and that we've got to control, and their regulations on disposal of that are just as onerous as getting rid of waste from a nuclear power plant. But we just haven't come to grips with making a proper waste dump. Now, we got to the situation in South Australia, and it was all basically agreed to by the community, and then I think some odd bod popped up. I'm not sure if it was Indigenous or something, and sort of threw it into question, and that's sort of gone by the boards. If we can't get the basic of creating just a disposal facility, it beggars belief that we can actually move on anywhere else from there, because it has to be an integral part to have. There's no way we're allowed to take our nuclear waste and dump it on someone else, like people might want us to do.
Look, the situation in Kimber in South Australia, I think, was a terrible situation. There was a activist group which was supported by organisations like Australian Conservation Foundation, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, which put considerable effort into opposing that low-level nuclear waste facility. It's not a dump. It is safely managed. The low-level waste is completely safe. And it was just a shame to see that happening. And I think that's part of the reason I've started Nuclear for Australia, is to combat the immense influence those anti-nuclear groups have in Australia, those groups which actually call themselves environmental organisations, yet deny one of the cleanest forms of energy that exists for humanity. I think in terms of nuclear waste, there's just a few things to step through, which I think make nuclear waste, not an issue, or certainly not an issue which should get in the way of lifting the bans on nuclear energy. So there are obviously three types of nuclear waste. There are low, intermediate, and high-level waste. They're ranked on their radioactivity and also the volume of that waste, going from low-level waste, which is the least radioactive but makes up the most volume, to high-level waste, which is the most radioactive but makes up the least volume of nuclear waste we have in the world. And currently, Australia safely manages low and intermediate level waste. Low level waste includes things like gloves, even the aprons that people will wear at the Lucas Heights reactor in Sydney. So it's it's incredibly safe. That's currently stored in over 100 locations around Australia, whether that be in hospitals, if it's associated with our nuclear medicine capability. It's also stored at Lucas Heights. And it's incredibly safe how that is stored. In terms of intermediate waste, I think that's a very interesting case, because that intermediate waste is basically the waste which is created as a result of our Lucas Heights reactor, our research reactor. And initially, when the spent fuel, the uranium which is used to power that reactor is used by the reactor and finishes as spent fuel, it actually has to be sent all the way to France to be processed, just so that we can legally deal with it, because we're not allowed to actually store that level of waste in Australia. So we have to send it over to France to be reprocessed, and then we ship it all the way back to Australia in this big metal canister. And people might be able to see a YouTube video of this. And it has to have a police escort all the way from the port all the way through to Lucas Heights, where it's then classified as intermediate level waste, which is able to be stored in Australia, and it's safely stored there at Lucas Heights. So there's huge loopholes in terms of that. Finally, and very quickly, in terms of high level waste, that's the waste that Australia clearly has not dealt with yet. We're going to have to deal with it as part of the AUKUS submarine announcement. The government made a commitment to deal with that waste and to have a facility on defence land to manage that waste. But there are a few points to it. First of all, it's an incredibly small volume of waste we're talking about. To power a person over their whole lifetime from nuclear energy, the amount of high-level waste, or spent fuel as it's called, because this high-level waste is basically the spent uranium fuel from a reactor, it's about the volume of, my cup here or a Coke can. And when you look at all the high-level waste ever created over the course of humanity from nuclear energy, it can easily fit inside a stadium. It's just that small in terms of volume. There's never been an accident attributed to high-level waste management. There's proven practices around the world for managing that and disposing of it. But in addition to that, high-level nuclear waste can actually be reprocessed or recycled because it retains so much of its energy, that spent fuel, once it first leaves the reactor, that it can be used up to 5 times, once again, recycled up to 5 times, which is simply incredible. And when you look at the waste argument more broadly, the really important point to make is that the nuclear industry is the only industry which is able to manage its waste. And I think that makes a really compelling case for nuclear energy. When we look to the energy sources we currently use in Australia, which no one has any problems with, they're certainly not banned. In terms of fossil fuels, the waste from fossil fuels ends up in our atmosphere. We have to breathe that in every day. Millions of people die per year from pollution as a result of fossil fuels. That has an impact on human health. What about renewables? Most renewables, whether it's solar panels, wind turbines, they cannot be recycled at the moment. There are measures in place where people are wanting to do it, but it's certainly not happening at the moment, and it's not economically feasible. Solar panels, wind turbines these days are being dumped in landfill, sometimes burned in countries around the world. That's having a really tangible effect on people's health. What's not having an effect on people's health is nuclear waste management. Yet, for some reason, that's the story that people hook onto the most and what people feel most strongly against, which makes no sense. So through my campaign Nuclear for Australia, all I'm doing is basically sharing information with people to dispel some of these myths, to make sure that we're not losing track of the science in these really, really important matters. Because if we were looking at the science, nuclear waste should be no issue for Australia. And given the nuclear expertise we have in Australia, I have no doubt that we not only would we able to be manage to safely manage it, but also we could be a world leader in it.
Yeah, the big problem still remains with the environmental lobby, and especially the activists within the conservation movement. And they're fairly hysterical in a lot of ways, from against coal, of course, and they're sort of preaching that we need to lower the emissions of carbon dioxide. And I'll put it to you right now. The carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, okay? It's a trace gas. It's essential for life, and it's plant food. But that's another point. But we have this phobia, and that's what they're pushing. We've got to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Their push is renewables, or unreliables, as I like to call them. One of the biggest problems is their footprint. Now, a one gigawatt power station, which is generally the standard, so I think a standard coal-fired power station is about 1.4 gigawatts. Most of the new nuclear plants come in around about 1.2 or 1.4 gigawatts output for one reactor. but to have a equivalent that supposedly can deliver you baseload power, you would need 9 Cooper Gap wind farms. Now, Cooper Gap wind farm covers 102 square kilometres, has 123 turbines. So you're talking, and you've got to have 9 of them to provide the base load power along with the batteries that's there. Now, that's 1,000 square kilometres. It's 900 odd turbines that you've got to dispose of at least every 20 years. And as you said at the moment, there is no disposal for these things at the moment. They're simply buried. One of the other frightening things that I just saw a video of the other day is actual wear and tear on the turbine blades, especially in the northern hemisphere where you've got fairly cold conditions. You've got places that have got a lot of hail, and the leading edges of those things have just been chipped away, and obviously the carbon for glass and the resin has just gone into the atmosphere or into the landscape. Is there any way you think we can have a rational discussion with the people who just got this push for renewables? And I would say you've met a few of them, like Mr. Bowen. Is there any way you think we can have a rational conversation with them and say, well, look, just on the sheer volume and footprint of these things, and it all affects regional Australia. I mean, these things are not being built in Sydney. They're not in Sydney Harbour. They're not around Potts Point or Toorak or anything like that. You know, they're up in our hills.
They're not in Brisbane.
So that. Yeah, I reckon we should just put them along the Brisbane River. But do you think we can ever have a rational debate with the proponents of renewables?
Oh, well, I really hope that we don't have wind turbines down the Brisbane River. And I think that would probably shock a lot of politicians in my area who a few of them are opposed to nuclear energy. I think that would probably get them to act, and maybe even the Queensland government, which I note also the opposition in Queensland, the Liberal National Party in Queensland is, against nuclear energy for some reason. And I'm sure if they had wind turbines down the Brisbane River, that might force them to reconsider. I think it's a very complicated debate, obviously, and I'm not really, I'm not a politician or anything, so I'm a 17-year-old. Not sure if I'm in the best position to be able to explain how politicians think, because sometimes, like a lot of young people, I'm pretty disillusioned with politicians and how the majority of them act, and I sometimes just simply don't understand what their motivations are. So it's a bit difficult to navigate. I think the first thing to say is, if they were serious about acting on climate change, then pursuing a 100% renewable energy route is probably the most difficult way to achieve any of their climate targets. Because if they were to look at all energy options, including nuclear energy, then that's a far better path to net zero. The only guaranteed path to net zero really is with nuclear energy when you look around the world. And I think the really important thing for me is that, whilst nuclear energy is a solution to climate change, which I think is a good thing, regardless of your views on climate change, it's really important that we shouldn't be making decisions just for the sake of the climate, because ultimately in Australia, whatever we do isn't going to have a big impact on overall carbon emissions, and therefore whatever link that has to the situation in Australia in terms of weather and climate-related events. The real impact we're going to have is that when we consider all energy options, and that's currently something that we're not able to do. I think in terms of your point in regards to the infrastructure and the land use footprint of nuclear versus renewables, there is obviously there's huge momentum at the moment against renewable installations across Australia, which are putting the government's climate targets in jeopardy. They've admitted that they're not on track to reach their climate targets at the moment. And I think there are a lot of far more pessimistic people in the community. I think, if in order to get the government on side, which for me is the priority, because I just do not see how we could have a sustainable nuclear industry in Australia without bipartisan support, the best thing is to meet them sort of in the middle. And I think nuclear energy is the best way to meet them in the middle, because nuclear energy is a technology that not only can solve the issues with climate change, but also at the same time can solve issues in terms of the energy crisis, reliability, and power crisis. So you're not having to invest in nuclear energy just for the sake of lowering carbon emissions. It's also got all of these other benefits, whether it's in terms of reliability or the incredibly low land footprint, where it requires hundreds of times less land than renewable installations. So my position is that I think nuclear energy could be a great uniter in Australian politics, able to deliver for all people, regardless of what issues that they care about. And I think it's just a shame that, you know, whilst a majority of Australians, according to all the best evidence we have, support nuclear energy and see the benefits it could have, all the different benefits it could have for them personally, the government just seems out of touch with that sentiment and too fixated on their politics of distraction and their own personal vendettas against nuclear energy to actually even consider it, when it could actually be something which when argued for, could really bring the country together and solve the decades of, you know, energy and climate debates that we've had in this country.
I think one of the most important things is, you know, nuclear reactors are very, very expensive. And when you look at a power plant, all they're replacing is the furnace. I mean, you still got to have the whole rest of the steam turbine situation. So it's a very, very expensive furnace, but it can sit on the same land site as we currently got our coal-fired stations over time, and we only need to connect to the existing grid and expand that grid as the population or industry increases. Although I don't think we'll have any issues with industry increasing, because we seem to be killing our industries in Australia with high electricity prices. But it's really a no-brainer in regards to land use, using the technology that's currently available, the infrastructure that's currently available without all the extra costs. We do have some problems, like you can talk in regards to, we've seen with the Federal National Party and the Liberal Party, there's some direction or support for nuclear, but you're still within those two parties. You do have people who are not on song, and they're the ones who really aren't on song with anything in the Liberal Party or the National Party. Sometimes I wonder why they're actually in those parties. But that's the Federal Party. But when you look at the state parties, especially the Liberal parties, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, they are not there, because it's the same old situation. If you look at Queensland, the landscape is that there's 73 seats within 200 kilometres of Brisbane. There's only 20 regional seats. Now, to sort of win over the people in those 73 centred around Brisbane, you've got to play a game on conservation. So I don't know if they're ever going to get brave enough to say, well, we want nuclear power and everyone has to suck it up.
And I think the most mind-boggling thing is when you consider that, you know, it should be the politicians in the city which care about nuclear energy the most, because there's no chance a nuclear reactor is going to be built in the middle of any city. That just simply does not happen around the world.
Or as a wind farm.
And it's more likely that you know, the citizens are going to have to deal with a community battery, which is actually quite dangerous. I think actually more statistically dangerous than a nuclear power station, or solar panels and wind turbines near their community or on the outskirts of a city. When you look at the current coal-fired power stations, like you said, they're great positions for nuclear power stations. And as those coal-fired power stations retire, there's huge benefit of being able to have nuclear reactors there to transition the workforce into them. They're, you know, very, very high-paying jobs. in the nuclear industry, very highly skilled, high-paying jobs. You don't get that same employment benefits in terms of renewables. I think, though, back to sort of the NIMBYism sort of argument, the great benefit with nuclear, and we were talking about this earlier, is that to produce the same amount of electricity as renewables, you just require less power stations than, you know, the equivalent number of solar panels or wind turbines you'd need, also considering the fact that when you are making that adjustment in that comparison against you know, the equivalent solar panels and wind turbines, you have to have even more of those solar panels and wind turbines to accommodate for the fact that they're not going to be, that you need to produce more power to provide backup during the time when the wind's not blowing and the sun isn't shining. So I think that, you know, politicians in those inner city areas, if they want to, if they're interested in conserving the environment, which I guess is a concern of their constituents, if they're interested in not being near, not having many power stations that they have to be next to for their constituents or whatever, then they should definitely embrace nuclear energy, as it's one of the lowest impact energy sources you can just possibly have. And it can be really, you know, behind the scenes churning away. Nuclear reactors can last anywhere from 60 to 100 years. That's a long-term investment. Once those nuclear reactors are built, they will be running in the background. There will be workers working in them, producing clean, reliable power that we can trust will keep the lights on regardless of the weather conditions. It just really is a no-brainer. And especially for a city person like me, living in the middle of Brisbane, where I know, just like we wouldn't have a coal-fired power station built in the middle of the city, nor would we have, you know, a solar farm or wind turbine, there's no chance I'm going to have to live anywhere near a nuclear power station. And even if I did have to live near a nuclear power station, I would actually be quite comfortable with that, considering how safe nuclear reactors are, and also the fact that living near a nuclear power station, you actually receive less radiation than you do living next to a coal-fired power station, because obviously burning coal produces radiation. I've also recently seen a tweet today that the manufacturing process for solar panels produces considerable amounts of radiation. So not only do you require less nuclear power plants to be installed to cover our needs as a society to have reliable power, but on top of that, on top of that, I've just lost my train of thought. You're not going to have those same community backlash issues from them being located near constituents of communities.
One of the other thing is too, with coal-fired power stations, you've got to dig up a reasonable amount of ground to get the coal.
Yeah.
With renewables, we have to have people and children in the Congo digging up cobalt. We need people in South America with these great big lithium installations with wet mining. I don't know if you've seen the devastation from some of those lithium mines. We need a lot of different minerals, and it's already been estimated. The world, if we had an electrified world, we'd go from 37 terawatt hours usage, you know, constantly to 57. Now, to provide that power we haven't got enough natural resources to do that for the first 20 years and of complete renewable renewables. We would be completely come to the second generation, after the first 20 years, we would have a lot of those resources that you need, mineral resources, would be gone. And not only that, gee, we'd have a lot of holes in the ground. So that's one thing the environmental lobby doesn't seem to reconcile. The amount of damage you need to do to the planet to save it with renewables, and then also you've got to dispose of all those things as well.
Yeah.
With nuclear, the fuel is relatively easy to get in a number of countries. It's a not an overly big mining operation to get the core energy requirements. So it has a much lesser footprint of any power generation system, either whether it's coal or renewables. The footprint for mining is relatively small.
It is. I think it's, yeah, really important to emphasize the point that every single energy source has an impact on the environment, whether that's fossil fuels, whether that's nuclear, whether that's renewables. I think there's a real issue currently in our debate with the term renewable, because renewable is just a marketing term. It means absolutely nothing to the environment, because there's nothing renewable about all of the components which go into all of the solar panels which we need to replace every 20 years, or all of the wind turbines which we also have to replace so often. The only thing that's actually renewable is the fact that the wind will always be blowing and the sun will always be shining. But in the grand scheme of
Somewhere,
things, yeah,
sometime.
well, hopefully, sorry, it's not all actually correction. It's not always blowing, and it's not always shining. And actually, we've seen that recently, you know, being in Queensland, that there hasn't been too much sun. It's been mainly storming. So, a correction there. It's not actually completely renewable. It is just a marketing term. It means absolutely nothing. And I get really, really actually quite frustrated when the government is putting all of this effort into, you know, so-called renewable targets. They mean absolutely nothing to the climate. If people cared about climate change, then they wouldn't care less about renewable targets, because renewable targets are just targets for industry. Renewable does not mean it's got some inherent advantage to the climate or the environment, because obviously to harness those renewable resources, you require a lot of finite resources in the process, which, according to a lot of research, those resources are at serious risk of running out if we're going to transform the world into an electric-only grid. That there is nothing renewable about it. If we were serious about facing climate change, then we would have clean energy targets, because clean is the metric that ultimately matters to the climate, which ultimately matters to the landscape and to the environment. But and clean energy options encompass nuclear energy. And I think it's really, really quite telling that in Australia, our governments have renewable energy targets, not clean energy targets, like they do have in other countries. And for me, I really see that as them not acting in the interest of Australians, in the interest of reliability, in the interest of climate, but just acting in the interest of the renewable industry, which obviously has a huge amount of force in the Australian debate. I think it's a, you know, it's a very, very complicated matter. The only last thing I'd say in regards to electrifying all of Australia is that, you know, if we're going to make everything reliant on electricity, that creates a huge impetus on the fact that that electricity is reliable. If your ability to drive in your car, to cook food, to have the lights on, to attend a hospital is all contingent on the lights being on and the energy being reliable, then why on earth are we putting all of the eggs in the basket of renewables, which we know are just inherently a less reliable technology than fossil fuels or nuclear energy? It makes absolutely no sense. If the priority is to electrify everything, then we would, you know, either keep fossil fuels at the detriment of, you know, carbon emissions, which some people see as an issue, or we would be using nuclear energy. There's just so many contradictions in it. And you know, for me as a young person, I think all of these different policy failures could be disastrous for my generation, whether it's my generation going to have to be dealing with ever increasing power prices, ever decreasing energy security, but also the fact that, you know, whilst that energy security is inevitably decreasing as a byproduct of extra investment in renewables, that's going to have a much more profound impact than it would have back in the day, because then I won't be able to cook, I won't be able to get anywhere in my car, I won't be able to turn the lights on in my house. All of the different technologies which I imagine I will be reliant on in the future will no longer be able to work. So it's just incredible we wouldn't be able to consider nuclear energy just given that.
I think one of the problems is too, we've got a government that's just got one train of thought. It's just got blinkers on and just going down that path, and it seems to be ignoring the lessons that are being learnt in other countries. So we've seen Germany go along the path of renewables and put a lot into it. The German industry is basically starting to fall over. It's lost a lot of its capacity. It's getting far too expensive for its industries. A lot of industries, of course, gone off China. I mean, the biggest beneficiaries from this net zero renewables target is communist China. The Western world is basically sacrificing itself. But we've seen the opposition in the United States now, and also the falling over of offshore wind projects from near New Jersey, protests again because of the whales and things like that. But it doesn't seem to register with this government in regards to, well, maybe we should have a bit of a rethink and around the table and try to get a bipartisan position on where we go to from here. We seem to just have a government that's just on a single track, and it's going full pelt, and it doesn't matter in regards to cost, reliability. The taxpayers are picking up the bulk of it, and the additional costs can be passed on to consumers. Do you have a message sort of for the politicians in regards to taking a breath where we are, especially after your visit to COP?
Yeah. I would say that, it's not only the Labor government, to a certain extent, it was also previous governments, including the Liberals, which had a really narrow focus in terms of the energy issues we're experiencing in Australia. The Liberal government did nothing for a decade on acting on nuclear energy until obviously what Peter Dutton and Ted O'Brien are currently doing. So I think that we've had huge issues with energy for a long time in Australia, and that is because that we're not looking to the global evidence. I think there is a general hubris to our energy policy in Australia where, it's either our way or the highway. We seem to think that, we're going to be the first country ever to get to 100% renewables and be a renewable energy superpower. We are failing when it comes to our energy system. And also, if, the people who care about the issue of climate change, we're failing around the world if it comes to reaching our climate targets, which we put a lot of focus on. So I don't think we can be in the business of ignoring other countries, the experiences they've had, whether it's successes or failures, and just, pursuing this really arrogant approach to our decisions in terms of energy. The one thing I would say is that, whilst I'm a nuclear advocate, I think that we need to be considering all options on the table. I think that renewables do have a role ultimately in our future grid. That should not be at the detriment of the communities or nature. I think, when you look at the rooftop solar revolution we've had in Australia, that is a positive thing. There are many positives from renewables, but I think that nuclear also has significant positives, and perhaps even more positives than renewables, and for that reason we should consider it. But I think there are huge lessons to be drawn from overseas. The example you bring up of Germany, how they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars on renewables. They're actually, as a result of closing their nuclear power stations, they're actually now having to revert back to coal for their energy. They've got some of the highest carbon emissions in Europe, whilst having some of the highest energy prices in Europe. So their plan to decarbonize has just utterly failed. But when you look to their country adjacent to them, France, they are powered by 70% nuclear. Like I said earlier, they're making ever-increasing investments in nuclear energy, looking to build a further 16 nuclear reactors on top of their nuclear reactors, which are producing so much of their energy at the moment. They've got some of the lowest carbon emissions in Europe. They've got some of the lowest power prices in Europe. And in fact, they export power to Germany, which is needing it. We should not, and if we follow the same path of we should not be following the path of those countries. It's a very, very dire situation. if we do. But I think the main point is just to say we shouldn't be acting with the same hubris we are by thinking that we can, somehow transition to 100% renewables,
Do it better.
fix climate change without nuclear.
The other thing is with France, I'm sure they look around at Germany and it's sort of cutting its own throat. And Spain isn't much better. That's committed to renewables to the nth degree. But I suppose if you could build 16 extra nuclear power stations, you've probably got a couple of good customers, potential customers there in the long run to make a profit.
Oh, most definitely. There are many, like I said earlier, there are so many countries, and whether it's, Australia, I'm assuming you're talking about Australia potentially being able to produce nuclear reactors for around the world. Am I correct in making that assumption?
I was just talking about France's situation and that suits them to that.
Yes.
Because even
And
Britain, it depends on the cross-channel connector.
yes.
So they've got plenty of customers.
Yeah, so at COP28, actually, I got an opportunity to talk to the French President Emmanuel Macron. And in that moment, I introduced myself as an Australian. And this is on video, people can see it on Nuclear for Australia social media channels. He called for Australia to lift the bans on nuclear energy. And France is certainly a country which we could collaborate with on to use their nuclear technologies and to work with them to solve the energy issues we're having in Australia. So I think that's, a really important point. I think there's no surprise why Emmanuel Macron chose that opportunity to intervene in our politics in the way he did like that. At COP28, he was, there were so many world leaders there, but he was probably the only one where you could look at him in the face and know that he has actually taken action to address climate change as compared to the other world leaders who are pursuing renewables, yet making no progress on their climate targets. The only country which really has done a really impressive job considering the scale of their energy needs in terms of addressing climate change is France. And they've done that through nuclear. And I think that's something that I realized at COP is that the countries which preach the most about solving climate change are also the ones like Australia, which are doing the least to actually consider clean energy options. And doing the most to ignore the countries which actually are making an impact on climate change. And those countries are the ones that are using nuclear energy. So I think it's a very strange situation, and it certainly makes me really passionate for what I'm fighting for with nuclear energy.
I think one of the things too is France is very mature in regards to nuclear energy. I mean, it built a suite of nuclear power stations in the 60s and 70s and is committed to it. Maybe we need to sort of try to import a bit of French mindset to get rid of some of this irrational fear that we seem to have about it. But the other thing, I don't have that much confidence in the Australian people in regards to getting over this fear. I think we may have to go down the nuclear track, head to disaster, and then have all the problems, and then maybe everyone will wake up and say, well, that didn't work, we've got to do something else.
Well, unfortunately, there are a lot of nuclear advocates and people against nuclear energy I've talked to who could be open to considering it one day, which actually say that, it will take a major blackout in Australia for us to finally consider the role of nuclear energy. And for me, I think that is way, way too late. I actually do have great optimism in the Australian people. I'm the founder of Nuclear for Australia, and through that, we've created the largest campaign for nuclear energy in Australia's history. We've got over 18,000 supporters. I've been able to do that all organically without, spending any money on advertising like the other big campaign groups do. I think that shows at one small example of the sentiment in Australia, the energy people have towards considering nuclear energy. And I think, even when you look at every single poll out there, it shows that more Australians support nuclear energy than don't. And, we haven't had to do much work to actually convince Australians of that was done, way before I ever entered this debate. And obviously there are fantastic people who are laying the groundwork for that, experts who were, increasing the nuclear literacy in this country. But, whether it's Q&A's poll, which showed that over, around 63% of Australians not only want us to lift the ban on nuclear energy, this is the ABC's audience, 11,000, a lot of them responded to this poll. 63% not only said they wanted us to lift the bans, but also wanted to use nuclear energy and build reactors in this country. That was the same results when they asked a similar question in regards to lifting the ban on nuclear energy. They asked that when I was on Q&A with the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen. That showed, I think it was something like just under 60% supported Australia lifting the ban. And I think those numbers will only grow as we build momentum and as people come together to support nuclear energy. And through that, we're able to boost nuclear literacy in the country, because the evidence also shows, and this is not only in Australia, but around the world, but as people become more informed about nuclear energy, the processes that are involved, all the facts and clear science behind it, then they are far, far more likely to support nuclear energy. And for someone, and I'd make it clear, we're not taught about nuclear energy in school. In actually a lot of jurisdictions, you're banned from talking about nuclear energy. And there's a few groups who have been involved in that. But even when we don't have that same level of nuclear literacy in this country, we have a population which clearly still sees the need for nuclear energy. And there's been very little effort in order to get Australia to that point. So I guess that's sort of justification for why I'm optimistic. But it still doesn't mean that, it's a considerable task to basically take on the decades of inaction on this issue and the really, really powerful groups which are, strongly opposed to nuclear energy. I think it's even worth mentioning
I think
the Energy Minister and I'll just mention this briefly, last year in a speech to a renewables energy conference, addressed them and told them that nuclear energy was the biggest threat to their industry. So there is no doubt that there are very, very powerful groups and very, very powerful people who see nuclear energy as a threat to their interests, not the interests of the Australian people. And it's about, building a movement which is able to overcome that tremendous influence that those groups and individuals do have.
Well, I think that's one of the most important parts. So I think there is a very strong lobby groups and people of influence who want to keep the renewables, or for a better word, the feeding troughs open, because there's a lot of money in it. And they're sort of well positioned for it. But like I say, I think probably the general public's more accepting, but we do have people of very strong rank and positions that we have to sort of overcome in the short term and medium term if we're going to get to where you want to see in the future.
Yes.
But I'm pretty sure I won't see it in my lifetime. We've gone over the hour. If you'd just like to wrap up in regards to Nuclear for Australia petition, we'll also put that on as part of the promotion when we put this up to up to YouTube and to Facebook permanently. But if you can just highlight what you continue to do, who you're working with, and when do you think you'll get to your goal of 20,000 signatures? I've signed.
Yeah, thank you very much for signing that. So yeah, like I said, Nuclear for Australia within a year became the largest campaign for nuclear energy in Australia's history. That is incredible, and that's thanks to the support of so many Australians across the country, obviously including you, so thank you for that. But currently, in terms of how you can support Nuclear for Australia, if you are interested in nuclear energy, if you want to be able to live in a country which is able to consider nuclear energy, which isn't a global outcast in terms of nuclear energy by denying its existence, then I would encourage, your audience to sign our petition at nuclearforaustralia.com/petition. They can also find a link on Nuclear for Australia's social media channels. We have social media profiles on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube. I've probably just forgotten one, but they'll be able to find the link somewhere. And they'll be growing a movement of now over 15,000 Australians who have signed that petition to lift the ban on nuclear energy. In terms of when I think we'll get to 20,000, I think it'll be very, very soon. We've actually had, I think, over 3,000 new supporters join us just in the space of January, which is just simply incredible. The momentum is definitely building. We've actually got a much larger goal, which we'll be able to announce soon for the end of the year, but it will certainly eclipse 20,000 by a considerable degree. I'd make the point, that our petition is one of the most successful petitions in the nuclear space in general. I think it might be one of the most popular petitions ever regarding nuclear energy in Australia, either for or against nuclear energy. So if there are any other petitions which have been started by those anti-nuclear lobbies, then we'll be pushing pretty hard to beat and challenge them. But there's a growing movement, and like I said, I'd really, really appreciate if people could join us by signing and sharing our petition at nuclearforaustralia.com, as that will really, really help propel the debate forward and provide us support to be able to conduct our advocacy, which will be expanding during the course of this year.
I suppose a few blackouts might help the position along as well.
To the detriment of everyone in the short term, but hopefully, like I said, it doesn't take that. And who knows what happens? But I'm hoping that there is a time where the government realizes that the people of Australia are not on board with their denial of nuclear energy, and that they are somehow compelled to act. But hopefully, it doesn't take blackouts or anything.
Well, hopefully they just see the maturity in Australians in regards to the things that we can do and we want to do, rather than sort of what we don't want, sort of. So
yeah, look, I better hope that we don't all have electric cars at the point that those blackouts start occurring, which people are predicting they do occur, because then there'll be no way I'll be able to drive myself to school or anything like that. So better hope that it happens maybe sooner than later, if that is the test that we're going to have to go through.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much for your time tonight. If you can just stay on the line, we'll have a little chat later, but I'll just introduce next week's show. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Joining me next week will be the Mayor of Carpentaria, Jack Baldwin, and also local Currumbra fisherman, Dave Wren. And we'll be discussing the ban on gill nets that's coming in or is already in force, and other restrictions in regards to quotas for commercial fishermen. So please join us again next Wednesday, when my guests will be the Mayor of Carpentaria and fisherman Dave Wren. Thank you.